And I'm recording some videos as some supplements to the in-class discussion that we're having at LaGuardia Community College, where I teach this class, and that's part of the City University of New York. So these videos are meant to supplement the discussion that we have in class, and they serve the purpose of allowing me to sort of reframe the stuff that we've said and kind of highlight the important, or what I think are the important components of the discussion. And the plan is roughly to have one for every week of the class. So LaGuardia is a bit unusual. We have a 12-week semester, so the plan is roughly to have 12 of these introductory videos. So I want to say a little bit about what the course content is. It's a philosophy of mind class, and if you're watching a video like this or you're taking a class like this, then you must have some interest in philosophy, and I don't want to spend too much time on that. I have another place where I address this issue in a bit more detail. But roughly, what I like to think that there are many different ways of approaching the question, what is philosophy? I have one particular approach to that question, which I find useful and which will sort of guide the way that I present the material. That doesn't mean that you have to agree with me or accept it. And I don't want to make a claim about it being the only way to think about philosophy. But I think it's a way that does make sense. In a nutshell, if you look back at history, what you see is that what we call philosophy begins when human beings attempt to understand the world that we live in on their own. So whereas what I call the pre-philosophical way of thinking was concerned with appealing to the gods and divine revelation, philosophy begins with human beings trying to look around and reverse engineer the world that we live in. And the idea that guides this is that the world is somehow orderly, that it's natural, and that human beings are equipped with certain tools which would allow them to discern the essential nature of this natural world, natural orderly world around us. And so we systematically begin to investigate the nature of reality and our relation to it. That's the beginning of philosophy. It's also the beginning of science. And around this time when this begins, which is about 600 years before year one or so, around this time when this begins, there's no real distinction between philosophy and science. That distinction comes much later. And that's the way that I tend to approach these issues. So rather than see philosophy on one side and science on the other side, I tend to see more of a continuum. And this is a view that's closely related to a philosopher who recently died in the 80s, Quine, W.B.O. Quine. So if you know anything about his view as philosophy is continuous with the sciences, then I find that a very congenial approach to things. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that, for instance, what we'll be doing in this class, philosophy, is a kind of science. It's a very abstract science at times, dealing with interpretation of data, dealing with conceptual relations, perhaps, but a very abstract science. Now, of course, there are more concrete sciences that deal with experimental results and acquiring those results, and we'll be appealing to some of those results as well, so that I think that there's a nice continuum here, and rather than say we'll just be doing conceptual stuff or we'll just be doing empirical stuff, or the two shouldn't meet, I'm going to suggest that a fruitful way forward is to look at the way that the two interact, and that this is kind of justified by the claim that philosophy simply consists in the systematic study of reality and our nature, reality and our relation to it. And of course, this would be then, the philosophy of mind would simply be that philosophical enterprise turned towards the mind itself. Now, I also happen to think that philosophy is distinguished by a certain kind of method, a certain approach to answering these questions that relies heavily on argument as a source of evidence. And so we'll look at some of this stuff as we move through the course material. For right now, I just want to say that I'm not going to be making any hard and fast distinctions between philosophy on the one hand and science on the other, and we're simply going to take philosophy of mind as the systematic study of the mind, sometimes being very abstract and conceptual, and sometimes being very concrete and empirical. So the first thing we want to do then is discuss a little bit about what the nature of the thing we're studying is. So what is the mind? What is it to be mental? Well, we can start with some common sense inventory of the kinds of things that we call mental. Things like beliefs, things like perception, that seems like a mental activity, attention, wondering, doubt, various sensations. If you look at this stuff, you might think, wow, well, it seems like there's one or two properties which look interesting and which seem like they might characterize all these things that we call mental. So on the one hand, we have a property called intentionality, and intentionality is what we're going to spend the second week of class on. So intentionality, very simply put, is the property that thoughts have of being directed towards or about objects. So for instance, right now, I'm thinking about the Empire State Building. I'm thinking that it is no longer the tallest building in New York City. So there's a thought. And it's natural to say that my thought has a target. It's not as though the thought isn't about anything. Someone were to say to me, what are you thinking about right now? I'd say, I'm thinking about the Empire State Building. And the Empire State Building is a real object. It's an existing physical structure in New York City. So my thought seems directed towards or somehow relevantly related to the actual building here in New York City. And what's interesting about this is it does, for instance, look like a relation between me and the building. I'm thinking about the building, and that relation doesn't seem to really depend on how far away I am from the building. I can think about it in California, I can think about it in orbit around the Earth, and in each case, and I can think about it here where I am recording this video in Brooklyn, and in each case, my thought is aimed at or picks out the very same physical object. Intentionality, we think about things. Now that's a very interesting property, the property of intentionality, and it seems to characterize a great many mental attitudes. For instance, I can think about things, I can wonder about things, I can desire that something be the case, I can intend that I do something of such and such and such and such. I can be afraid that something is going to occur. So all of these things look like they're directed or aimed towards something. If I'm afraid that there will be a terrorist attack, then the occurrence of an attack is what my fear is directed towards. It's intentionally directed towards that. Now, some people have gone so far as to say that this property, being intentionally directed towards an object, is the thing which is distinctively had by all and only mental things. Or to put that in a bit better English, that intentionality is the mark of the mental, or the thing which we know makes a mental object mental. What is it about that makes it mental? The answer here would be intentionality. Now, of course, some people deny that intentionality is the mark of the mental. It seems to do a very good job for characterizing thoughts and desires and beliefs and wonderings and so forth. But many people have thought that there are mental items which do not have any sort of intentionality. And predominant on that list are perceptions and sensations, bodily sensations in particular. Pain, for instance, hunger maybe. So when you see red or hear a sound, one thing that you might think is that that is not directed at something in the same way as my thought that that thing is red is directed at the red object there. Now, the philosophy of perception is what we're going to be spending the second week on. So we were just talking about the question of whether perceptions and sensations have intentional aboutness or whether they're directed at something. Now, one thing we will talk about is that many people have suggested that they do, even though they don't seem like it. Like, for instance, maybe a pain which occurs in the knuckle, and you might say is located there. Perhaps that is merely located in the brain, and it represents the pain as being located here, or in other words, that the pain is sort of intentionally directed at a certain part of the body, even if it isn't really located there. Now, that's an interesting and complex idea called intentionalism about the sensory properties, and we're going to get to that later in the third week, which is when we're going to be dealing with questions about the philosophy of perception. So that's the other thing that the question that we're asking is intentionality the mark of the mental? Some people say it characterizes thoughts, and it can also characterize sensory phenomenon like pains and red and so forth, although that's a hotly debated question. And then the other question there for us is, well, what is it that distinguishes something like a sensation of red or perception of red from thinking about red? So I'm having a thought about red, and I'm having a perception of red, like I'm seeing red versus thinking about red. Well, what's the difference? Well, one clear and obvious difference, I hope, is that when you're seeing red, it looks a certain way. It looks like red. Now, we call that, sometimes people call that the sensory quality. Sometimes people use the technical term qualia or quale in the singular. Sometimes people talk about the phenomenal property. Whatever it is, what we're talking about is the redness of the thing which you're experiencing. So your thought about red, like when you think red is a color, now you may picture red, and then that would be a mental image, which is more closely related to a perception or a sensation, although there's a question about what exactly the relation is between a picturing or imagining, where we mean imaging, like having an actual image in one's mind, and perceiving or sensing, and we'll look at that. But many people think that this property, the qualia or whatever it is, the redness of the red, the sound of the bell, the feel of a smooth surface, that those things are not intentional, or, if to put it a bit more modestly, if they do involve some kind of intentionality, that's not all that there is to them, that there is in addition also a phenomenal property, a qualitative property, some kind of aspect of the experience which distinguishes the red experience from the green experience. That would be what it's like to have those properties, perhaps, or maybe something to do with the way it functions in one's behavioral outputs and inputs. Those have been the various candidates. Now, some people would take the opposite route and claim what the mark of the mental is that every mental thing has phenomenality or phenomenology, or there's something that it's like for the creature who has it. Now, of course, some people will deny that every mental state has some kind of qualitative property or phenomenal feel, and of course thoughts have been one candidate here. When you think the thought that 2 + 2 = 4, doesn't immediately strike one that it's the same kind of thing like seeing red, and so maybe we just have these two categories: intentionality on the one hand, and sensory quality, qualitative character, phenomenal feel, or something like that on the other hand. And maybe we can say that to be mental is to have one or the other of these two properties. So you find people in all three camps. People say intentionality characterizes every mental state. People who say phenomenal feel, qualitative character, characterizes every mental state. And people who say no, it's rather a hodgepodge mix of intentional stuff and phenomenal stuff. So that's going to be the set of questions which occupies us for the first 2 weeks. We're going to look at intentionality and mental content. What does it mean for a thought to be about something? Do you have to be related to the world in a certain way? Is there a language of thought? Does it have to be computational, or is there connections? Does it have to be more neural or brain-like? So there are a lot of different questions that we'll be addressing in that section. And then in the next week after that, the third week, we'll move to the philosophy of perception, and we'll be dealing with these questions about what it means to see, read, or hear a sound. Now, one of the central questions in the philosophy of perception is whether perception involves a direct awareness of the external world, a direct awareness of mind-independent objects which exist even when we're not perceiving them, or whether perception involves a kind of awareness of a mental object, and then that mental object either stands for or represents or somehow is in between us and the actual physical object in the world external to us. So on the one hand, we have people known as naive realists or direct realists, and they believe that perception is a kind of openness to the world, like that the eyes are like a window, and you're just like looking through the window, and the window doesn't get in the way, you just see through it to the thing that's outside. The thing that's outside is the way that it is. So that the table that I'm looking at is the way that it is, even when I'm not looking at it. Now, on the other hand, there are people who think, well, you see, there's something mental that gets in between you and the table. That mental thing is called a representation, maybe. It's called an idea, an experience, something like that, which is the thing that you're aware of, and then you're only, if you're lucky at best, you're only indirectly aware of the physical object external to you. And the thing that really pushes us and pulls here are two sort of common sense thoughts about perception. So on the one hand, when you perceive something, it seems like you're directly related to it. It's like I said, it's like a window, you're right there. It's like a direct line between you and it. But on the other hand, there are states which seem hard to reconcile with that directness. Illusions, for instance, hallucinations, dreaming. There are cases when it seems you have to appeal to something intermediary between the object and you. For instance, just really quickly, if you put a straight stick in water and it appears bent, and then you say, okay, well, that's an illusion, but it still is the case that you experience something which appears to have the property of being bent. And you might wonder, what is that thing? The actual physical stick is not bent. So which thing has the property of being bent? Well, some people have responded, the mental image, the mental thing that you're aware of, that's the property that has the property of being bent. The physical object, which is standing for in between, doesn't have that property. So that would be an indirect view about perception in this area. So that's what we're going to be turning to in the third week in the philosophy of perception. And after that, we'll be moving to more traditional questions. So having sort of looked at the two accounts, so looking at thought on the one hand and looking at perception on the other hand, intentionality, characterizing thought, qualitative character, phenomenal field, characterizing perception, trying to figure out what the relation between them is and how they track or relate to the external world. After we sort of think about the mind in general, we'll turn to the question of where that fits into reality. And we'll start addressing the more traditional questions where people start here, where Descartes started, like, is the mind physical? At that point, we'll address the arguments which have been given that the mind is not a part of physical reality and that it could not be a part of physical reality. So we'll look at dualism and also some other non-physical alternatives, some other strange views. So in week 4, we'll do traditional dualism and look at some issues about mental causation. How do these two things relate if the mind is not the body? The problem of other minds. How do we know about other people's minds given the difference? We'll look at those issues. In the 5th week, we'll look at some of the reactions. Idealism, solipsism, panpsychism. That's going to be very interesting. Especially we'll look at epiphenomenalism. And we'll read some Huxley, which I think is a wonderfully brilliant piece, making a case for epiphenomenalism even though that's very counterintuitive. Epiphenomenalism is the view that the mind consists in properties which are caused by the brain, but which in fact have no causal effect in turn on the brain. So that the mind is inert, it's there and real, but not causally active. It's a very interesting view, not very commonsensical, obviously, but there's some arguments for it. So after that, we're going to look at some I'm sorry, and one of the more interesting arguments from epiphenomenalism comes from looking at actual physiology and the anatomy of reflex loops and so forth and so on, which is what Huxley does. And it's actually pretty interesting to see how much of behavior can be automated and doesn't really require the input of conscious experience. Whether that's all of it or not, I don't know, that's a hard question, but it's surprising how good of a job and how far you can get without having any of that stuff do anything. Now, of course, one thing that hasn't come up in the discussion yet is the relation of the mind to the brain. So what role is the brain playing here at all? Well, if dualism is true, the brain is not playing much of a role at all, maybe like a broadcasting role, or it's not exactly clear what role the brain could be playing if dualism is true, but we'll look at that. Then, though, we'll look at the more contemporary views which try to take the brain more seriously, the first of which is the identity theory, which claims that certain aspects of the mind simply are the brain. And then we could debate about which aspects. What about, is it mood? Is it thoughts? Is it emotions? Is it sensations? Is it perceptions? Is it all of them? There are various moves that can be made here. And if, after examining the dispute over whether the mind is identical to the brain, we'll look at the more current rise of what's known as functionalism. Psychology sometimes called information processing theory. The basic idea there, to put it way too simply at the beginning, but in a way that will flesh out later, the basic idea is that the brain is a naturally evolved computer made out of neurons, and that the mind, what we call the mind and consciousness, is simply software which runs on that computer. So that's functionalism. Now, how is it different than the identity theory? Well, very basically, the functionalists believe that there can be other kinds of computers which run the same software, just like a Mac and a PC can run Windows. So to a human brain and, you know, an alien brain that doesn't have any kind of neurons at all, and also maybe even a computer brain made out of silicon, could all run the same software that we call mind and consciousness. Okay, so once we look at all that stuff, then in week 8, we're going to come to the question of consciousness. So all of that just sort of mind in general, thinking, and we're going to not make a big distinction between thought, thinking, and feeling, although we'll make the appropriate distinctions along the way. But then we're going to look specifically at the problem of consciousness. Is it different than mind? What's the relation between consciousness and mind? We're going to look at the claims that have been made that whatever we do about other mental things like thinking and so forth, that consciousness resists any kind of scientific explanation. We're going to look at modal arguments against it, the claim that it's impossible, or that we can know a priori that it cannot be the case that consciousness is a physical product. Then finally, we will look at some specific issues. Can computers think? Do they have consciousness? Can we know that we don't live in a simulation? Are we simulated? Are we computer simulations? Is there the possibility of giving a specific physical account of consciousness? We'll look at some of the attempts, higher order theories versus first order theories. And then finally, we'll look at one of the more challenging views known as eliminative materialism, which is simply the claim that consciousness doesn't exist, at least not in the way that we think that it does. And that's a very challenging view, that the mind, as it appears from the inside, isn't something which exists, at least not as we commonsensically conceive of it. Okay, so having now gone over the course syllabus and given you an idea of the kinds of things we're going to be talking about in the rest of the semester, I want to use the rest of our introductory time here to talk about how we might answer those questions. So we want to know what intentionality is. How are we going to figure that out? We want to know if the mind is physical or not. What kind of evidence are we going to use? Now, I gave you some idea already that I see this continuum between, on the one hand, the empirical sciences in the laboratory, and on the other hand, the theoretical sciences in the armchair. And I think that the same person can occupy both of those roles at different times in their career, or even during the course of the same day. So the evidence we have before us can come from natural sciences, it can come from pure philosophical reflection. But what are the sources of evidence in either of those categories that are going to be relevant to the questions we'll be talking about? Well, first of all, we'll start with something really close to us. We'll start with the notion of introspection. Now, there's obviously, at least on occasion, times where we know what we're thinking or know what we're feeling. So when you're in pain, you know that you're in pain. You believe that you're in pain. When you're thinking something, if someone says to you, what are you thinking about? It's not very difficult to provide an answer. It's not as though you have to stop for a second and say, oh, well, I don't know what I was thinking about. No, I'm not denying that there are times like that, or that there can be times like that. What I'm saying is that in the typical case of thinking, we are aware of the contents of our own thoughts in an immediate and kind of really nice and direct way. And whatever it is that allows us to do that, we call introspection. So that's an ability that we have. That's something that we start with as a data point, if you like technical correctness. So then the question is, well, what is this thing? Well, common sense tells us it's just some kind of access to our own mind. And there are different views about how we have that kind of access. Some people say, well, look, it's like perception, right? You perceive the redness of the table, and then you can kind of also look inside and perceive your perception. Inner perception views have been very popular. But there also are views that ascribe it to a version of the intellect, or to a capacity for having higher order thoughts, thinking or monitoring, or in some other cognitive-like relationship, more like thinking to one's own mental life. So whatever the true nature of introspection is an interesting question, and we'll spend a little bit of time looking at it. But many people have thought that introspection was a source of evidence about the nature of the mind itself. And this is probably one of the more traditional views in philosophy and maybe even psychology, the idea that introspection provides us with a unique, maybe even privileged access to what goes on in our own mind. And two ideas associated with introspection are going to come up, and we'll talk about them. The idea of infallibility and incorrigibility. So to take one before the other, the more familiar one probably, infallibility, you can use these words in a lot of ways, and I don't want to, say this is the only right way to use these words, but this is the way we'll be using the words when people are talking to me. So to say that an introspective belief or judgment is infallible is simply to say that you can't be wrong about it. That if you think you're in pain and you believe that, then that's impossible for that judgment or belief to be wrong. Notice this is a claim about your introspective judgments or knowledge of your own mental state, that it's direct in such a way that it doesn't allow for cases of getting it wrong in the way that normal, ordinary knowledge claims do. Like you might say, I know that this is the case, and someone says, nope. You find out, or excuse me, I shouldn't have said that. I know that this is the case, and then you later find out, oh, you were wrong about that. So infallibility is the denial of that. And the classic person here is Descartes. Descartes seemed to think, or at least he's often portrayed as thinking. I guess you could debate about whether he actually thought this, but it certainly seems like he thinks that when you introspect, you have immediate and direct access to the contents of your own mind in such a way that if you think that this is the case, can't be wrong. And notice, that also goes the other way. So if you say, I'm not in pain, then you can't be wrong about that. So not only is it that you can't be wrong when you say, ow, that hurts, no one can, you can't find out that you are not actually in pain, but also if you are sincerely believing that you're not in pain. Infallibility would claim that, well, okay, you aren't in pain then, because you have an infallible access to the contents of your own mind. Now, another idea associated with introspection is what's sometimes called incorrigibility, and people use these words in different ways, and again, I don't want to really make too much of a fuss about the right way, quote unquote, to use a word. But I will say that one common way in philosophy that the word incorrigibility is used is to pick out the idea that there's a kind of access to your own mental state which is unique and which no one else has. So the rough idea is that when you make an introspective judgment, like that you are in pain or that you are hungry or that you think that whatever, that you are the greatest authority on that there is nobody who is in a position to know more about what's going on in your own mind than you are, and the result is that you cannot be corrected or overruled, so that someone cannot come along and say, actually, you're mistaken about that. You go, ouch, I'm in pain, and they say, no, you're mistaken. The claim is that's impossible. Now, excuse me. Now, I'm not saying that introspection does have these properties. What I'm saying is that many people have thought they have these properties, and that maybe if there are problems with them, we can give limited defenses of them. So now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. We're going to look at some empirical evidence and look at some philosophical debates that suggest that maybe there's some problems with introspection. How big and how many problems is something that we're going to address. But the main claim that I'm making right now is just that introspection seems like one kind of source of evidence, at least at the beginning, for knowing about the mind. I mean, you might think it's the thing we know the most about, right? We're closest to it in a way, and there's no space between me and my own mind. Or at least you might think at the beginning of inquiry. Okay, so that's one source of evidence. Now, of course, that's knowledge about my own mind, but of course, much empirical science is based on observation, and observation has to be, you might think, public and repeatable so that other people can observe the same thing. And if you can't observe the contents of my mind, then you might want to focus on something else. And so many people have said, look, to study the mind, you study its outward expression. You can't get at the thing itself. So you study its outward expression, and one way of doing that would be to look at behavior. And so psychologists will often use the behavior of animals as an indication of what kind of mental state they're in. A kind of obvious example here is if you're looking at a mouse and you want to know if the mouse is afraid or not, you could check its heart rate. They do freezing behaviors where a mouse will freeze. And that's a way of knowing that it's alert to danger. So now, of course, we're going to notice that there's some philosophical questions here that arise between the relationship between behavior on the one hand and mental states on the other. Now, there was a school of philosophy known as behaviorism, which claimed that that's all there was to the mind was behavior. And that the internal states somehow don't really matter as much as people think that they do. And that's an interesting idea that we'll touch briefly on when we look at the early identity theories and so forth and so on, and the precursors to functionalism. But we won't spend too much time on behaviorism, to be quite frank with you. Okay. Now, of course, one kind of behavior that we rely on a lot is verbal behavior, speaking, like I'm doing right now. And clearly, commonsensically, what we would say is that we use language to express thoughts. So, in common sense, we recognize a close relationship between language on the one hand and thoughts on the other hand, intentional states. So one strategy you might have is to look at the structure of language and try to use that to infer something about the thing which produces it, the mind, and the thing which it's used to express, or which language sometimes is thought to encode, thoughts. So one source of evidence, introspection; another source of evidence, behavior, like the way you behave. Still a third source of evidence, maybe a subcategory under behavior, language. And many people have thought that language tells us something important about thought. So for instance, we'll look at the debate over whether there's a language of thought closely associated with Jerry Fodor. And Fodor, for instance, argues that there are certain properties which natural language has, which thoughts also possess. And so therefore thoughts must have something like a similar structure to the language in which they're expressed. The rough idea here being that they must have components, like word-size components that can be restructured along certain lines, like that if you say, you are happy, you can turn that into a question by taking the are and moving it. Are you happy? Now you can also think the same thoughts. I can think the thought, you are happy. And I can think the thought, are you happy? So Fodor's rough idea, and we'll spend a lot of time on this later in the intentionality section, but the rough idea here is that, well, there must be a similar kind of structure in the thought that allows for the same kind of manipulation. So if in the language we have some kind of grammar or syntactic change where you can take the R and move it and then produce a new thing, so that thought must have a similar kind of structure. And that's a very popular way of thinking about the mind, is by looking at language as a kind of view or clue to what's going on inside the mind. Okay, so that's a third source of evidence. Now finally, another source of evidence that you would categorize under the behavior general category, and which is much more modern and contemporary, is looking at the brain. So now we, in this day and age, think that the brain is responsible for the behavior, both verbal and also bodily. And so it would be nice to be able to see what the brain itself is doing. And for a long time that was not possible. But now we have some visualizing technology, MRI being the primary ones, and EEG, for instance. So this gives us the ability to look at what the brain is doing, what kind of behavior it exhibits while people are doing specific tasks. And this is the more recent development of functional MRI, fMRI, and also what are called event-related potentials, which is EEG, which is recordings from the scalp brain activity, which are taken and coded to an event which is being done, like for instance a task, a sorting task, or a button press task, just to give an example. So roughly the idea is that one possible source of evidence about what the mind is up to is by looking at what the brain is doing. And we can look at what the brain is doing using the techniques from neuroscience and cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology. Sorry, cognitive neuropsychology is what I meant to say. Okay, so behavior will give us a lot of evidence. But of course, it doesn't address the philosophical questions of, is behavior all that there is? And of course, this brings us to what we might consider the very last source of evidence, which is a priori reasoning, or reasoning about cases and what would be the case, or what could have been the case. These are two different conceptions which we'll tease apart later in the semester. But one idea is that the world is a certain way, and we want to study the way that it is. But there's another question. Which is, does it have to be that way, or could it have been a different way? An even slightly different question related to that question, which is, given the way that it is, and given the way that it could have been, what ways could be made into worlds, even if they don't happen to be our world? Now, those kinds of questions can't be answered by empirical science, because if you want to know how the world could have been different given the way that it is, well, we can't go back and look. So we've got to have some other kind of evidence, and many people have thought that one kind of evidence about possibility, what's possible, what's impossible, is what's conceivable or what's imaginable. And This, again, isn't supposed to tell us, or maybe it is, excuse me, what I'm supposed to say. In the first instance, what this is supposed to tell us about is ways the world could be, or the ways the world could have been. And then in other instances, if some people claim, if you're careful, this can also tell us about the way the world actually is. So a priori reasoning plays an important role, and if you want to know whether the brain is the mind, for instance, one important question is, could it be something else? That's a question that functionalists ask. Could a computer be conscious? Well, we don't have a conscious computer, so that's a question about what's possible, what's impossible. And in this area, thought experiments are going to play a crucial role. And one thing we'll do is we'll examine various thought experiments. What would happen if this were the case? What would happen if that had been the case? Could that have been the case? And then we might wonder, well, is this a reliable method? And one of the problems here, one of the questions that we'll address, is whether or not any one of these methods that we've laid out, these basic methods, introspection, looking at behavior, and a priori reasoning, whether these methods can help us shed light on the questions we're interested in, and maybe on each other. For instance, what is the relation between the empirical sciences and the data that they produce, and the a priori sciences and the data that they produce, logic, for instance, and mathematics, and reasoning based on those kinds of things.